Okay, I hit record and I'm with Liz Mason.
Yeah,
Liz, tell us where you are in your author journey.
right. Actually, it's a very long story, and I'm going to shorten it because I tend to write and sort of take a long time. But I started writing when I was very young. I did a lot of reading, and so therefore, one of my first books when I was about 7 or 8 that I recall vividly was Black Beauty. Of course, we're going back a long time,
Yeah, yeah, no, I
and
love Black Beauty as a book.
and I love horses and I love cats. Okay, and I've done a lot of horse riding throughout the world actually until a few years ago when COVID came. It was a bit difficult, and I've stopped now because I'm older,
Mm.
and I've still got my cats. Not the same one, of course, but my first story, my first rejection was when I wrote not Black Beauty, obviously. I wrote this story on horses and what have you, and it was a specific length, and it was on radio, and I got this wonderful letter, which I still have, from the BBC, which is the British Broadcasting
Mhm.
Corporation, saying, "Dear Liz Watt," well, Elizabeth, of course, was called me, and Watt was my maiden name. "Dear Liz, thank you so much for your very interesting story." They'd actually asked for stories for this
Yeah.
particular
Okay.
children's thing.
Yeah.
And as I say, I was 8. So, however, we have many, but thank you so much. Keep writing.
Oh, well, hey, at least they
And
said
I
keep
was
writing.
rejected.
Oh, yeah. As rejections go, though, that's not terrible.
No,
They
it
told you to
wasn't.
keep
It,
going.
it
Yeah.
wasn't. And then life happened. And I was a teacher. I was a teacher all my life. In fact, I owned my own independent school for 22 years
Wow.
until I actually retired. And so I was doing a lot of, well, all subjects, but a language and how to write correct. And we had a lot of writing. Well, I don't know if you do it in the USA, but in the UK, but writing in essay form.
Hmm.
And a lot of the children were moving on to their senior independent schools, so they had to be correct in language, etc., etc. So I did a
Hmm.
lot. But when I started horse riding, freedom,
Yeah.
freedom from teaching, I had been horse riding. I've horse ridden since I was 19, but I wanted to start going abroad. And I'll
Hmm.
cut all the other places out. One of the ones I went to, which was about 15 years ago, was Zimbabwe,
Hmm.
which is, as you'll see in the story. But what I was very much taken by were the people there, because they were under huge duress.
Hmm.
So a lot of that story there, so that formed a story in my mind. And the
Hmm.
following year was horse riding in Mongolia, and I had this long. I was on the Trans-Siberian, and I had this long train. I went to places in Russia, but there was this long, just seeing tundra, tundra, tundra,
Hmm.
and I started to try and finish the story. And I was
Hmm.
sitting in this narrow bunk, top bunk, no option to choose. You're
Yeah.
there. And I finished it, very poor lighting, and I finished the first edit of it.
Wow.
Anyway, right. Years later, along came, well, no, I was on all the webinars and things like that here for interest, and just a lot of it's mostly American. I don't seem to put into any British ones. I don't know if they run them, but anyway, and it was to do in a month of November,
Hmm.
a complete story. So I
Yeah.
started another one.
Okay.
And that was when I was riding in Machu Picchu. But it's actually got nothing to do with the people there. It was just, it's a murder on Machu Picchu.
Nice.
And actually, I shouldn't actually say who I wanted to murder. I won't say who I wanted to murder. But anyway, that was in the story. So I did a 60,000 there. And then I thought, I really should go back to my first novel and try and
Yeah.
start some editing. And I have to say, with the last few years of editing, I absolutely love editing. I want
Nice.
somebody's story to edit, but maybe I have to get myself sorted first. So I did a lot of editing and started to send bits off to get
Hmm.
comments on it. And anyway, stop there just now, and I'll go back to where I am. My independent school was in Kirkcaldy in Fife, which is central Scotland. And when I sold it, I moved up here, and which is a place called Blairgowrie in Scotland. It's middle Scotland,
Hmm.
which was only half an hour, well, maybe 40 minutes from the ski lifts in Glen Shee. And of course, I was a skier, so of course, as soon as there was snow, I was doing the 40 minutes up there and back down, and all the other things it takes. But in between times, the writing. When I write, I tend to write for a solid 3, 4, 5 hours. I forget time exists. Or when
Wow.
I edit,
That's a
I
long
sometimes
spread.
do that. It is a long spread, but I don't, yeah, I just do it. The mood hits me.
That's
So
great.
therefore,
Yeah.
I do that. And then there's might be a huge, well, there's things happening in life just now. I mean, I have three daughters. One is married to an American in Minnesota. I've got one living in Perth, which is only 40 minutes away from me, and one daughter living in Edinburgh, which is the capital city. So I do see them quite a few times. But then bits and pieces come in, and there's celebrations or there's trips somewhere, and suddenly I lose the impetus. So really, until it was coming near, I'd already put in for your time. I think, oh my God, I better go and read what I was ending up. So I went back to that. But I'm anxious, if this doesn't take off, right, I will go and try and edit my one in Machu Picchu. I am a traveler. I have traveled from a very young age on my, well, after my parents were always very good, but I traveled when I was 16 to Germany on my own for a month, staying with this girl. She'd come over to us. It was a kind of a school exchange. And I really have itchy feet. So I travel and I travel and I travel and love it, love visiting all these places, but love meeting the people on the whole. And people are difficult for me to write on, I've been told. I have the most vivid imagination of all the places I've been, and I'm actually a keen photographer. So I photograph a lot and I write up, it not to sell, and obviously I have to do this online, but I make books of all the travels. Excuse me. So maybe that's a kind of writer I should stick to, but I won't, because there are far too many travel writers with crews behind them are taking their photographs. So yes, I'm quite ambitious in what I was doing, but there comes a time when you think, you know, it would be really good just to get one. I'm not against people doing indie, but I don't want to do indie. I've done a lot of research on this novel.
Sure.
Apart from the fact that my brother, he had a business in Harare, way back, 50 odd years ago now. Well, he came out when there was the Troubles. I was there with the Troubles. Well, a second lot of Troubles. And I phoned, he said, look, my friend still stays there in Zimbabwe. So I called him. Oh, I don't know what you're worried about. Come over, do your horse riding, blah, blah, blah. So I did. But it was a very strange period. And the Shona guide, English-speaking Shona guide, and his I had to have one. Everybody cancelled. I was the only one there. So there was one behind me, one in front. We were going from I can say cabin, whatever it is, from place to place on a 7-day tour on the area. That was near Victoria Falls, or south of it. And God, did he tell me the stories of the living. He was married with a daughter, and I did meet them on the horseback. He said, I'm going to take you to where my wife is. So I thought, that's lovely. But so I was impressed at the ability that these people could still work in a different role, by the way, a lot of them. But because he'd been a farmer, or he wanted to be a farmer, but of course that was out. There were no white people almost left. They were all being kicked out then. But my very close friend from school's brother went out to Zimbabwe as a young chap. They were from farming stock, and he started a tobacco and maize corn farm. And he married a white Zimbabwe girl. They're still out there. But his 3 children are all different places around the world. But so I got a bit of insight. His farm, everything was taken from him. He didn't have a penny after, 40 years of working there. So I got a bit of insight there, and I thought, how do they get? Well, he still stayed there. Oh, he said, I couldn't come back. Anyway, his wife was white Zimbabwean. And so, and I feel for people, and I am that person, but I'm not so good at putting that person in with you try. I mean, I've been told once or twice, because I've sent sections to various people, you need to open out about the character. I thought I had, but this last lady who took my whole evaluation said, remember, you are you. You need to tell your characters to the people you're reading. I thought I had. So anyway, that was the difficult part.
That's interesting. No, I'm really glad you shared that. That's interesting. I I love how much research and how like deeply you've moved into the story. I think part of what I love about reading and what you're bringing to your book is that uh experience with perspective, which is part of what I think is, sets novels apart as a special art. Like we can watch, like I could watch a video about Zimbabwe, I could watch a documentary about it, and that has perspective. But what you're talking about, the like pulling somebody into an emotional scene in which we really relive it in our own imagination, is something unique to that novels can do. So I
Mhm.
think I love that you've put so much deep, that you have such deep feelings about it and you're in it, that it's real to you in this great way. And I think there's really good seeds there of something that could be a really wonderful novel that helps people experience this as you've experienced it. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
no, it does. It
Yeah.
does. I mean, there are some graphic pieces there, but on one of the places we were at, there was a white Zimbabwean lady and her daughter,
Mm.
and she was the one. Their farm, her husband went back to England, but she didn't have a passport. She was left with the two kids. Anyway, but she was telling me that, I mean, they lost the farm and everything, the horrors. It was her daughter who was raped,
Oh, wow.
and she gave, but obviously she didn't tell me who wants to be. The daughter's nearby, and
Yeah.
so I did a bit of research about these sort of things. But it happened, and there were. I mean, I'm talking about 30, 40 thousands of Zimbabweans, as
Yeah.
well as killed off. And I thought, have I brought this too much to the story? It isn't an odd. Well, it was a single scene in my story because it was one family I was following, but there's facts there. It's not. I mean, it's
Yeah.
fictional as well.
Yeah. And I think the I think the difficulty you're gonna have, and this is just me kind of future casting, I don't know if this is true or not, but the difficulty I would have writing this story is that there are going to be so many heightened scenes of tragedy.
Mhm.
And I know when I write those, I feel them.
Yeah.
And so if you keep editing through this book, just buckle up because you're going to need to feel a lot of really dark stuff. Um,
That's why I threw in. You obviously hadn't had them. I threw in, although the evaluator said, not sure if that was part of the story. She went horse riding looking for her husband who got lost at this time. I mean, was taken to prison because he was. There's too long a story behind it all. But one scene was horse riding. There was a bit of fun in that, and then there was another one. Separated because they were separated for some time when he had to get a job, and he took a job in a canoe company, and there's a bit of drama there, but it's a different drama,
yeah,
And
yeah,
I
yeah,
didn't know. And then I was told that these two scenes might not have been part of the story. And I thought, oh, what do I do now?
yeah. And I think you have to balance. I can feel you in the piece that you sent me. I can feel you still searching for this story. It's
Right.
there. It's buried under some stuff, but it's there. And I have a feeling as you dig that story out, you're going to be balancing. You've got two stories going. You've got the story of these people and their personal lives and their relationships, and the story of Zimbabwe and what's happening politically. And they're going to kind of collide with each other. And so
Right.
you're gonna need the scenes of, like, in the piece you sent me, there's the scene of the husband and wife talking about, farming and what they're gonna plant. You're gonna need those because those are the people that we're going to fall in love with in the novel and that we're going to see. And if you don't have the scenes of, like you're describing, of her horseback riding through the country, if we don't fall in love with those people, then this is just a documentary about what happened in Zimbabwe, and you might as well
Mhm.
write it as a nonfiction book, right? Like, what
Too
makes this
many
a
of them.
novel is the connection between
Right.
people,
Mm.
and it's what makes historical fiction like this beautiful, is that we get to live a moment in history through some people's eyes. So I think I think you're on to something there, but I think I can see what your editor's saying, what your editor was saying, and that like we do need to dig the story out here a little bit more. Um,
Right. That's my problem. I'm looking, thinking, what can I do? I mean, it would end up probably 100,000 words, maybe by the time I've dug it all out.
these books are always big. And I just want to warn the books where you're taking a historical event like this and combining it with a family drama, like this is, this is kind of classic Michener, like what he did with like Hawaii and I think he's the one that
Right.
wrote Hawaii. Um, or it's like the Grapes of Wrath. It's
Right.
those stories that take these historical moments and then have you live them through the eyes of a family. They always end up being long, but that's okay. We love it that way because, and they have to be because
Mhm.
you're telling the it's normal people in abnormal circumstances is kind of
Yeah.
what these stories end up being. Like these are normal people that in everyday circumstances would make a very boring novel, but they're thrown into these moments of historical turmoil, and in that moment of historical turmoil, we learn who they are, and they learn who they are, and we watch through their eyes as they're forced to adapt to these things happening around them. Um, that's what makes these novels great. So it is going to be long, and I
Mhm.
think my recommendation, and we'll talk about this in a second. I really want to talk to you about finding your scenes and then
Mhm.
leaning into your scenes, because what you sent me has a lot of buried scenes in it, and there's
All
moments
right.
where you're writing me some paragraphs and I'm like, oh, this summary has to be a scene. I have to see this, I have to live it for this
Right.
book to work. And so I want to talk to you about finding your scenes and when you've got one as an editor, and then how to blow those scenes out to make them part of the story. And that's what I mean by like digging out your story. There's places where it's buried.
And
Does
it
that make
doesn't
sense?
make it, it doesn't make it, what's the word? You know, that it doesn't make it smooth. And does it, or does it appear to become smooth if you're digging out a story like from your main theme that's running through, and then you're producing from? And I know exactly what you're saying.
Hmm.
I just wondered. I haven't even tried that.
Yeah, my bet is you have two big edits to do on this book.
Right.
The first edit is you're going to do a lot of writing, a lot of drafting. You're going to
Right.
come through the book, and again, I only looked at 3,000 words, but just seeing what you sent me, you're going to come through the book and you're going to find these summary moments, which we'll talk about in a second how to find them.
Okay.
And you're going to have to write those as scenes. And then
Right.
what you're going to have, like you're saying, is a whole bunch of scenes where you're like, whoo,
Where'd I put them?
what am I? Well, not just, but how do these connect? What's going
Yeah.
on? And then your next draft, your last draft will be looking at the characters, your point of view characters, and separating out their storylines
Right.
and being like, how does this character grow? What's this character's experience through this thing? And in that, like, normal person, abnormal circumstances, how do these abnormal circumstances change them? And
Mhm.
you'll be able to pull out the scenes, like order the scenes by point of view. Be like,
Right.
okay, these are the scenes in this character's point of view. Do I have enough of them? Am
Oh,
I
right.
telling this individual's story well?
Mhm.
And then when you line up the individual stories, then you'll see like, okay, I need a couple scenes for this person's story. I need a couple scenes for this person's story. Because like at the end, you give me the sexual assault scene, you pull that out. I'm gonna need that person's scenes leading up to that moment.
Oh, yeah, there were, of course, yes.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
of course, yeah. And then I'm gonna need her scenes after that moment. Because this is a pivotal, like, emotional crisis
Yes.
that shapes people. And so I'm going to need her story pulled out. And this is going to be a moment in her story where it's like, oh, how did this change her? And that's your
Mhm.
book. Your book is like,
Mhm.
how was this person changed by what happened? And you're
Right.
going to have in these historical novels, you always have like several POVs, and we're going to watch how each of them are changed. And the
Right.
book is about like, look at what this thing in history did to these people,
Right.
for good and bad. Some of them are going to change. You're going to, as you pull them out, you're going to find like, oh, some of these people have very heroic story arcs.
Yes. Yeah.
Some of these people have very tragic story arcs. And you're
Yeah.
gonna line them up. And then when you've lined them up like that in the second draft, that's when you're going to go, okay, I need a couple more scenes here, or these, I have too many. I don't need all of these. Like some of these
Right.
can go away. And
Right.
then you'll put them back together, and that'll actually be your book.
Yeah. I mean, the
Does that make
saddest
sense?
story with her, she got AIDS because AIDS is
Oh,
utterly
yeah,
prevalent
yeah.
in the, well, not just Zimbabwe. I mean, I've been to
Hmm.
South Africa, that as well, and various
Especially
things.
at that
But
time. Yeah.
when you're talking about the follow up, yes,
Yeah.
so that went on for several chapters actually because of the tragedy of all, and they were totally distraught, especially the mother, and what could they do in Africa, in Zimbabwe? They haven't the same medical care and
Hmm.
blah blah. And women weren't really much talked about over there at that time anyway. Because I'm going back about, well, it says in the story to that time.
Do you do a lot of, when you write, you said you have these long stints. It sounds to me like you are more a discovery writer, whereas you're writing, you're planning the stories you write.
Exactly.
Okay. So this kind of heavy editing is very common for writers like you.
Right.
Because you find joy in the discovery and you're like
Mm.
learning, you're thinking through your fingers as you write.
Right.
And so we don't want to lose that. We want to keep that. But it does mean on the back end, what you end up having is a draft where the story still has to be found.
Brought out. Yeah.
Yeah. And so
Mhm.
that's what, and I read this, I was like, oh, she's still searching for her story. It's here. It's definitely here,
Mhm.
but you're still looking for it. Okay, so let's look at the page. Are you okay if we transition to looking at the page so I can show you a little what I'm
Oh,
talking about?
totally. Yes. Yes.
Right.
Let me just bring it up.
Oh, here, I'll
I'm.
share my screen and we can look at
Oh
it
yeah. Oh,
together.
good. Yeah, it would be
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
Um, have you heard me before talk about the difference between exposition and dialogue?
Well, your name was very familiar when it came up to do this, so I must have been on something,
Okay.
before. But I know exactly what you're saying. Let
Okay.
me put it that way.
So let me do it quickly. You give me when you start the piece, we have these paragraphs in which you're describing kind of the historical tension of what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very well written, they're very informative, and they have a nice linear flow to them. You can see how it's just big paragraph after big paragraph.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, I'm the reason I'm zooming into this moment is because I'm pulling into this is because I want to give you some tools today as an editor to look
Okay.
at and be like, okay, what's going on? The minute I see, as an editor, the minute I see a bunch of big chunk paragraphs like this, I don't even have to read them. I can just skim them and be like, okay, we are telling, right? Like we talk about the difference
Yeah.
between showing and telling.
Yeah.
This is telling, and telling isn't necessarily bad. It's got a bad rap. Um, it has these kind of expositional paragraphs where you're describing or summarizing or um giving large portions of personal reflection from somebody from a perspective. They're very slow to read
All right.
and they feel heavy to a reader. I'm going to
Oh.
contrast those with if we come down here to where your first scene kind of really takes off, which is here on page 7.
Mm-hmm.
You can just see the difference with your eye when we have character interaction. You have vocalizations where people are talking. There's more back and forth. The page moves a little bit quicker. Does that make sense?
Oh yes.
Can you
Yes.
see the difference between like just looking at it? This is dialogue. Dialogue being the interaction between characters.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, oh, that was weird. This is exposition.
Right.
Exposition
Can I
being,
say the one thing
yeah,
that amazed me? When she got the full evaluation, the editor, she said there wasn't enough history for somebody to understand what was following. Now that first paragraph had sorry, first paragraph, first chapter, literally had far, far less. So what I had done, and it's obviously wrong, I'd taken lots of bits where these backstory bits
Yeah.
were to do with the person. He'd suddenly come to a situation, especially the young chap Caleb, and it's gone back into history. Well, I'd gone back into history and given the bit. So I brought these all out of the story and put them in. And I quite agree. I thought it was very heavy. You think you're reading a history novel. So I didn't know. I mean, that was the first person I said, oh, you should bring it all in, tell people what the state of the circumstances were before. And but I had brought them in the backstory, but then you do get sections of backstory, of course.
Yeah. And I think the advice, so there is no wrong. There is no right or wrong. There's just tools. Right. We have different tools we use, and those tools have a different impact on the story we're telling. I agree. I think that you do need to give us this historical context, but I want it in dialogue. And so the impact of exposition, well, here's a good way to talk about it. Like, you've traveled a ton. This is an illustration I use because it helps me understand it. I took my kids to New York a couple years ago, to New York City. It was their first time going. And as we were approaching the city on the ferry, you can see all of Manhattan laid out. The huge, giant city. The Statue of Liberty is kind of off in the distance, and they're standing on the ferry and they're taking in the whole island of Manhattan, and you get this kind of awe-inspired thing. And I have 5 children, and they're never quiet. But in that moment, they're quiet, and they're just kind of taking in what's going on. And it's this reflective moment. And it can feel, in those reflective moments, it can feel heavy. It's like, oh, man, I'm breathing here, something that's happening. Fast forward 20 minutes, we're in the middle of Manhattan, we're in Times Square, and there's lights and there's sounds and there's people all around us, and they're walking and they're talking, and we're feeling, we can smell the city, right? Like, every city has kind of a smell to it. We can smell the city and we can feel the air, and we're live in the place, right? Like, you're a traveler, you get those two.
Oh yeah.
So these are your 2 tools as a writer. Expositional paragraphs are those moments of awe and wonder where the reader leaves the story for a minute and looks at it as a whole, as if they've left the city and are looking at the city as a whole, and they're taking it on. And they create wonder, and they create distance, and they allow the reader to reflect and breathe a little bit, but they are a little heavy. And as you're sitting on the ferry taking in all of Manhattan, you get this urge of like, I want to get in there. I want to see it. So the more you make me sit on the ferry, the madder I get. The more I'm like, get me into the city, right? Like, now, if we're in the city and you're walking around the city and you're feeling it in, there's moments where you're like, hey, I need a break. I need to get back on the ferry and zoom out and take this in for a minute, and then I can go back into the city, because you can't just live in Times Square. You'll go crazy, right? Like, so you have these 2 tools. Now, great novels, especially novels like this one might be someday, they're going to spend 60, 70, 80% of the novel in Times Square. The majority of the novel is going to be in the interaction.
Right.
And then we're going to zoom out and take in the story. And then we're going to come back into the interaction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So
what I'm thinking all the time you're speaking is, how on earth do you put in dialogue? I didn't really want to expand on Mugabe. I've read a lot about him. My brother's told me about him. He met him when he was over there all these years ago. I didn't want to make the story about him. I wanted to and these sections I'd taken out from the backstory had affected Caleb mostly, and the father, which I have described actually when they came marching on him. But how do you split up? Because it is a watch of history, and it's over a time scale.
Yeah. And so what I would do is, and again, you've got 2 edits here. you're going to have to find your scenes.
Uh-huh.
Where are the moments where we need to be in Times Square?
Right.
And then you're going to have to mark everything else as like, where does this fit? How do I keep this? Write the
Ah,
scenes, and then you'll look at the whole thing and be like, okay, well, this scene doesn't make any sense unless you know who Mugabe is. So I am
right.
going to have to get on a ferry for a minute, and I am going to have to look at Manhattan, because Times Square doesn't make any sense unless you've seen
No, I agree.
Manhattan, right? Like, so you got to back up and look at it. So as we're reading through, this is what I'm looking for. Anytime you get, as an editor, anytime you get character specific, meaning one of your characters,
Uh-huh.
that's when I want to zoom in, and that's the scene I need to see. So I was reading through all of this, and the first scene I see is here.
You'd highlighted one about Mugabe just a bit back.
Yeah, this is me just saying, like, I'm just exploring, like, hey, where do we
Oh,
need to
sorry. Gotcha.
be? Yeah, like, what's going on? Like,
Yeah.
I'm just kind of processing, like, man, this is a lot of history in my early
Yeah.
notes, talking
Yeah.
about what you and I just talked about. Like,
Yeah.
we may
Gotcha.
need to zoom out of this.
Yeah.
Um, and the problem, so here's the issue with these, like, before we zoom into a scene, one more thing about this. The interaction of characters being present in Times Square creates emotional energy
Right.
because the reader feels there. They feel
Mhm.
present, and it's why we read novels, because we feel present in these
Yeah.
moments, right?
Mhm.
Um, the reflections, we think they have more energy, but this is the showing versus telling thing.
Mhm.
When you start telling me things, it actually has less energy and it becomes like a class.
Yeah. Yeah.
So getting into the exposition and the reflections, you actually pull me out of the emotion. So when you have an emotional moment like this, where
Oh, yeah.
this is, I got to page 5 and I was like, oh, this is the first moment we need. When the
Mhm.
first confrontation with the militants happened, Blake was working in his north field. I read that and I was like, this is a scene. I need to emotionally experience this scene. But instead of giving me the scene, you summarize it for me in
Yeah.
paragraph form. This needs to be your first, or it may not be your first in the end, but
No.
this needs to be 7 or 8 pages of interaction.
Oof.
I need Blake in a field. I
Mhm.
need him with his servant. I need them talking about the field and what they're doing. I need them to hear the crowd approaching. I
Okay.
need them to wonder what's coming. I need them to go back to talking about the farm, but Blake has some anxiety about what's happening. I need them to see the banners. I need them to be like, oh my gosh. I need the servant to be like, we should leave. I need Blake to be like, I'm not leaving my farm. I need the servant to be like, we've got to go. We can't stay. And then you summarize here, right? Like, with conviction in his voice and tears streaming down his face. Now, well, let me read the whole line. With conviction in his voice and tears streaming down his face, he shared with everyone how working at his farm had changed his life. He spoke about being a bigger part of something bigger than himself gave him purpose and pride. You are conveying emotion. You're trying to tell me what Times Square looks like while you're on the ferry.
God,
And
yes.
it doesn't work, right? Like, I have to be in Times Square. So you have to
Right.
build me to the moment. You have to take me to this thing where the altercations reach their peak. I need to see that and feel that in the interactions of the characters. I need to see Blake yelling at them. I need to see them yelling back at him. I need to see him in kind of a courageous way stand up on something, get everybody's attention, and
Excellent.
I need to see his voice crack. I need to feel his tears as he gives this speech about bigger than himself. And then I need the crowd to react poorly, because that's not what they're here for. And you
No.
say his servant kind of pulls him out, right? Like, and I need to see that moment.
Right. God, that's
Um,
good.
so when you're editing, anytime you find yourself talking about something that happened to somebody that is one of your characters, write that scene. This isn't wasted work. You're discovering your story. So take that and write that scene. And you're going to get, like I said, by the end, you're going to have a whole bunch of disjointed scenes.
Yes.
But you're going to line them up. And once you line them up, I promise, Liz, you'll see it. You'll be like, here's the
Right.
story. This is Blake's
Right.
story. This is what I
Right.
need to tell about Blake. Um,
Right.
does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. I
Okay.
just want you to finish my story now.
You don't want me to look at it yet. You have more writing to do.
I
Uh,
have, by the sound of it. Yeah. Oh my
yeah.
God.
So we get into, there's a couple more times I see this. Here's another great opening scene that I want to see. We get to Blake's determination became apparent. So we wrap up that moment. And then here, and by the way, I just want you to know this is very common in discovery writers. When I work with discovery writers, this is something I see in y'all a lot because you're like free flowing your story. You're finding these moments as you go. You've got to go back and rewrite them. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
So here's another one. Today he brought the tractor to a sudden halt at the periphery of his land and stared at the furrows stretching in the distance. His mind went into overdrive, remembering his neighbor's warning over rumbles of resistance in the community. Early land seizures crowded his mind, and he gripped the steering wheel. So you are summarizing for me an emotional moment. You're telling me he remembered being in Times Square and how the lights and the activity gave him a headache. Well, put me in Times, like show me that, right? Like take me here. So this scene actually needs to come before this impassioned plea, and you can get a ton of your history in this scene in an argument with his neighbor
All right.
about what's happening. They can have, just like neighbors do, right? Like I had an argument with my neighbor yesterday about American politics. We were both out on the front lawn,
Oh,
and
whoops.
yeah, and he said something, and the problem is I have teenagers and they can't, like, I'll let it go and be like, all right, we're gonna be neighborly and I'm just gonna move on. My teenagers are like, what did you just say? And I'm like, oh no. Like so like all of a
That's
sudden
the
I'm in the
trouble when they get old enough to start in on you.
that's right. They're old enough to start in, and they're not cynical enough as I am to like have been beat down by the political system, so they still like want to talk about it. So they're but that's the that moment. If I were to pull that moment out, I could put it in a novel, and you'd learn a ton about American politics in this current moment in the debate that my kids had with the neighbor. Right.
Wow.
And so here's another emotional moment. And then what I was reading for, you can feel the difference between this, right? His mind went into overdrive, remembering his neighbor's warning and rumbles of resistance in the community. I'm mining for emotional gold. I'm like,
Right.
oh, here's emotional gold. You can feel the difference between that and when we come up to like places where I'm like, there's the on Mugabe's return, because of his continued pursuit for independence, the Rhodesian government imprisoned him from 1964 to 1974. There's no emotional gold here. I
No,
don't,
it's
I,
facts.
yeah, there's nothing. So I don't, that's something I'm just going to put aside and be like, okay, I might need to put this in the novel, but
Right.
this is the scene I need to write.
Right.
Um, about the neighbors arguing with each other. It's further down, sorry. About the neighbors arguing with each other. This is the scene I need to write because here's the Times Square moment. Here's the moment where I feel things. And you'll be surprised as to how much of that history you can get into one of these things. Right? You
So
can
you
have
mean I should that actually, albeit although it might be slightly changed in its writing of it, but that scene should be up where
it should be your first scene, because, and the reason it needs to be up is because again, you're telling Blake's story. This leads into his hopefulness that he can talk to this mob.
right.
The argument with the neighbor
Oh
leads
yeah, all
into,
right.
and you can give me all the history of why this mob is coming with the neighbor.
Right.
And he can have an argument with the neighbor and have all the, you can give me all the history. They can even argue about Mugabe and what happened to Mugabe. And the neighbor can be like, and I don't know I don't know anything about the politics, but just from what You've written the neighbor can be like, well, Mugabe, blah, 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 blah. And then you have Blake be like, do I engage with this? Do I not engage
Do
with
you know
this? What
that
do I
is so
do?
interesting, Jeff? Because Caleb, I actually kept the same name, but anyway, I can change that. He said to me, that the trouble, because it was voting between Changarai and Mugabe, so all the scenes of 25 years ago had come back up and what have you, and I mean in history,
Yeah.
repeating itself. And he said to me, the trouble, he said, with the Shona people, we're lazy. Now, that was his opinion, of course. He said, and also he said, we hadn't the expert, well, he didn't use the word expertise. We didn't know they have the know-how, and we enjoyed working with the white owners. And I thought, and by that time, of course, 2/3 of them had already, they're still trying to get rid of it. They're actually coming back now, all these years later, the white farmers, because they realized that they didn't have the knowledge.
Yeah.
But that was his thing. We're lazy. We couldn't do this. So actually, yeah, they wanted their own country because they thought they might get the farms. But in the end, they couldn't work the farms.
Yeah.
And that was his own thought. And he was in his 30s. And I thought, God, what a situation to be in. I haven't mentioned that, but it's exactly what you're saying. That's a thought that he thought about his own people.
Yeah. And it's that, and that's the conversation we need, is the perspectives in the present of your novel about the past. And it's a little like that Mary Poppins song, "A spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down." Right? Like the sugar is the like conversation between the neighbors. That's what we want to, that's the novel moment we want to live in. That's fun. The medicine is the history as they talk to each other and share their perspectives on what happened with one another as they conflict with each other. We delight in their emotional interaction.
Yeah.
And we get the history. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a huge task. It's almost bigger than writing it.
It's a big task. This is why I think sometimes writing novels is so hard. And this is why I was saying, like, you have a very heightened emotional book here in which you have all these moments of intense emotion that you're gonna have to write. And part of me is like, do you want to write this? Because this is heavy. Right? Like Political Unrest is a heavy book, and there's a lot in here. I think it can be a great book. I think these are the moments that like create books that we love. But it is heavy. It's not an easy write. Does that make sense?
No. Well, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if I'm fit for that.
Well, and I think this is I tell my kids a lot. Part of the beauty of writing a book is that you find yourself in the words. Right. Like, and I think that's the question I have with every book I've ever written is, am I fit for this? Is this something I can do? I think that's part of the challenge of the novel.
I've read one or two books, obviously, the Yellow Sun, whatever the whole time, and all these sort of things. It's not the same because this is one. Well, it's not the same because I've lived through this. Not lived it. I've lived the story I'm writing. So I don't, but yeah, they were all fantastic books, great books. And I did read a book, somebody gave it to me actually, whose husband had been, no, not husband, relative, had been in Zimbabwe, had a white farm in Zimbabwe. He was white and he'd been kicked out. And I saw so many errors in it that I thought, and I said to the lady, thank you so much, it was an interesting read, but she said, oh, he said it was self-published. And I thought, there you go. And now I don't mean it was terrible. It was just not complete enough.
Yeah, and the nice thing about traditional publishing is that if you can write a manuscript that an agent likes and or that a traditional publisher likes and is willing to accept, is that you do get a team that comes around you and helps you produce that book.
And I do now think I need a team.
Yeah, well, and the truth is, like, I indie publish, and the truth is I have to just build my own team. Right. Like I end up using editors and, when I was super poor, I was like begging, borrowing and stealing for editors, but you end up you end up working with editors and stuff. You just got to find them on your own. So like the real question I've come to see like indie versus traditional is like, where do you want the pain? You're going to get pain. You either have to get pain in like trying to convince somebody that your book is worth their time and their team, or normally, the pain comes in building your own team, but you're going to have pain. So like, where do
you when you're writing, and I have done this a way back before I wrote a second or started my second one. Better not say I wrote it because obviously there's times there I've got to change. But you had only 5,000 words, or the first chapters or something. And there was one editor who loved the beginning. Obviously, only got part of it, and I hadn't even worked out the rest of it. But anyway, she wrote, and she changed a sentence, and I thought, oh, I never thought of writing it like that. There's exactly the same stuff.
That's why editors are great. Yeah.
Oh, they are. Yeah. They were. And that's actually in the story somewhere, wherever it was changed. And I thought it was only a couple of words she'd done. I thought, why didn't I write like that? Because I can write like that. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah, and let me make a comment about that to go back to what we were talking about. You have to, because an editor, if you're going to go traditional publishing, because an agent or an editor is only going to look at the first 5,000 words, you have to start in Times Square. You cannot start on the ferry. I have to start in Times Square.
That's exactly what I thought I did when I only had 500 or 750 words. And then she said, no, you've got to put the whole thing. And I had a lot of that, of the first hard section, as you say, in the reminiscences of the person who was, it brought back this memory, it brought back that memory. I didn't use that word all the time with it. And I thought that was better, but maybe it wasn't. I don't know.
It's not that it's right or wrong. I think you're just discovering the story. And I think character, so if we think about the 3 types of writing you just gave, because, and I want to talk about this because later you have a character by themselves reflecting. So if we have characters interacting in a scene, or we have a character alone remembering interaction, or we have description, right? The most energy and emotional excitement comes from characters interacting. The least energy and emotional excitement, but the most information comes from the description. Moments alone or in between. It's very difficult to write those moments alone and capture the emotional energy of just putting me in the moment. You can do it, but it's very hard. So whenever you can, give me the scene. Give me the characters interacting. Whenever that's possible, give me that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So good news is that when I get to your actual dialogue, so I get to like characters interacting by page 7, it's really strong. What's the scene, and this is why I thought like, well, this is what Liz needs to talk about with me, because your character interactions are really good. I want a lot more of this, of characters together. So the good news is that you can do it. Like it's possible for you to do it. It's just we just need a lot more of it. Does that make sense?
Oh yes, but that I totally understand what you're saying, Jeff. The only point is that whole first 1,000 words, which I chose to write because she suggested it. There is nothing I don't want to go into really Mugabe, because thousands of people have. I mean, you could look it up and, you know, and all. And I just wanted to give his factual, I mean, let's face it, he was a very poor chap, born in poor circumstances, and he rose to what he was, terrific. But of course, he turned the whole thing around and messed the whole thing, as often powerful people do. But I don't want to go. The story was the family in this torn country.
Yeah, and that's what you want.
Yeah.
But you can get that history in again, like with neighbors arguing with each other. They can drift into an argument about Mugabe, and you can even express what's beautiful about putting that kind of stuff in character interaction is you can even express what you're expressing right now. Your main character can be like, I don't want to talk about this. Why are we talking about this again? People have debated this for years. And then have the neighbor be like, well, but Mugabe, what you don't understand is Mugabe. And have him be like, I don't want to talk about it. Right? Like, so you can take how you feel about it, put it into your character, and like put that into part of the dialogue, right? Like,
so you would change that whole first section about 1,000 words on them?
Oh, I'd delete it. I'd delete it. What I would do, Liz, is I would go through and I would look for these scenes, these summary moments where you've summarized something. And then I would say, like, okay, I've got these facts, and then I've got this scene. My reader wants the scene. So write the scene, see what facts stay and what don't.
Right.
And then you're going to have a whole nother edit where you line up all the scenes. You're going to be like, okay, do these scenes make sense?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm really happy about that, because I really didn't like regurgitating.
Yeah. It's not
I
fun.
mean, it
I
does.
mean, it's
It
fun
does.
for a moment, and here's where you want it, right? Like, so here's where you want that regurgitation, that like moment on the ferry. We have a nice conversation here on page 7, um, between Blake and Diane.
Yeah.
Right? Blake took a deep breath, answering, "Because we added these acres of tobacco, I overreached somewhat." I agree. I didn't see you much. Nonsense, Blake told her, but her remark had an impact and tightened his grip around her. Diane ignored the pressure he applied and said, "What if you suggest that tomorrow she farms the section? Maybe maize instead, easier to manage at first." This is a very sweet moment between a couple, right? I I bet I
Which
just changed your words here a little bit, but they're fine.
I know that's fine.
I bet she'll jump at the chance. I know she's been mooing about
Do
the
you know the word
farm.
mooning? I didn't know if that was a Scottish word.
I
Mooning is
don't I
moaning about.
don't know it, but I
It, it meant she was really going. Well, maybe I should change it for some. To moon around means you're kind of fruitless. You know, you're doing things, you're doing some things, you're doing other
yeah.
things, and so therefore, when her Caleb, who had been with her when she was younger, and was working with the father, this was the chance, and that was a purpose for her.
Yeah, and I think I got what it meant by the context.
Right.
I think the question you're asking though isn't did I know what it is, but does Blake know what it is? Because the question is like, would somebody in Zimbabwe this time use the word mooning? That's the question you have to ask.
Well, he was right too. He was
Yeah.
white, to remember. They were white.
Yeah, and so he might. I can't answer. I don't know if he would or not.
No,
But so
no, I'll
yeah,
maybe change.
yeah.
My parents used to say, well, "Stop mooning about. Go find something to do. Read a book." You know that
I
sort of
love that.
thing. You know.
That's really funny. Um,
Yeah, but I'll maybe change that. Yeah.
yeah, so here we get a break in the topic. She says,
Right.
he says, "I know she's been mooning about the farm, so responsibility will give her purpose." And then you have a descriptive sentence here. "The setting of the sun merged with the land and disappearing in the last burst of radiance as the shadows raced toward them." You give me one brief moment on the ferry before you come back into.
And that's all right or not all
That's
right.
great. I need
All
those
right.
breaths. I need a
All right.
moment as a reader to
Right.
breathe. If you just keep leave me in Times Square the whole time, I lose my mind. So you want to put these moments in between topic changes, right? Like they're in a conversation, they're topic changing. But the reason I'm pointing this out is you could put more here if you wanted to.
Ah,
If you
see.
have descriptive stuff about the farm or about what they're seeing or about what they're doing, that you're like, oh, here's some facts that I took out earlier.
Ah,
This is a
right.
spot where you can put that in and not interrupt the dialogue
Right.
because we're in a topic change. So in the topic change, you can also do it in big emotional shifts, right?
Right.
Like, yeah. Um, okay, we have a couple minutes left. There's one more thing I wanted to talk to you about.
Okay.
You sent me that at the end, we jumped chapters and we got to the sexual assault scene.
Yeah.
It's very well written. Um, and you're in the moment, which makes it hard and like tough to read. The Remember, emotional impact comes from characters interacting.
Right.
The more minute you describe the interaction,
Yeah,
the
I thought
more
that wasn't good.
the more powerful the moment will be.
Right.
So when you have a moment like this of like sexual assault, that's this heightened, huge moment, get minute. Get minute in the interactions, because the more minute you get in the interactions, the longer you force me as the
To
reader
think
to
about it.
sit in this painful moment, right? So here
Mm.
you've got this legs, like they held her legs apart, the full weight of one of the soldiers bore down on her. Make a meal out of that. They grabbed her ankles, they pulled them
Oh, I
apart.
see what you're saying. All right.
She tried to yank them back together. Their hands were rough on her skin. They ripped at her again. She couldn't overcome them.
Right.
She thrashed to stop her from thrashing. One of the soldiers put his full weight on her. She could smell this. She could taste
Oh
this in her
my God.
mouth.
Oh,
She could
you are making a
feel this
meal of it.
inside. Does that make sense?
Oh God,
Get
yeah.
minute. in these
Right.
heightened emotional moments
Right.
and make me feel it. And that's going to bring the power of the moment.
Right.
And
Oh.
readers are going to love and hate it. They're going to be
Hmm.
like, oh my gosh, this is so painful.
Hmm.
And this is what I was talking about. You've got this really heightened emotional book. It's going to be tough to write some of these. When
Yeah.
I write a scene like this, I've written a couple scenes like this where, and usually I'm working out my own trauma, but I like in my last book, Inside Outside, I added a scene. I used to work with a lot of homeless addicts, and I had a moment with one of
Uh-huh.
them where he almost died in my car because he was ODing in my car. I was trying to get him to the hospital, and he's throwing up everywhere, and he's ODing in my car, and I was like
Mhm.
desperately speeding through traffic while I'm trying to keep him awake to get him to the emergency room.
You're
So that
sending shivers up my body.
right, but so I wrote that scene into my last book, and I needed 3 days. I couldn't write for 3 days. I had to walk and I had to draft it. The hard thing about this is I had to edit that scene like 5 times. I couldn't get it right.
Yeah.
But I it's so emotional. I wrote it and then I had to walk away. I was like,
Mhm.
and it takes a
I've
lot of
actually changed. You're right. I've had to change it. I thought it's too graphic. It's too graphic, and I cut out. The thing. I thought I'll try and put it factually down, but it's wrong. I totally understand what you're saying,
yeah.
but it really. I thought, oh my god, because I'm not touched wood. Thank God that I've ever been raped, but I've heard quite a lot of stories and read into quite a few to see exactly what Well, as a woman, it's what you might feel if you were
Yeah.
and that's hard enough anyway. God forsake. But yeah, so I did take some out, but I see what you're saying. Far more impactful is what you're saying.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be sexually explicit.
No.
Right. Like I think if you want a great example of this in the book Beartown by Friedrich Bachman, he describes a sexual assault um
Right.
that is incredibly painful, but not sexually explicit at all. It is about the moments that he leaves it in the moments you're talking about. The girl struggling, her arm being held,
Yeah.
trying to push against this person who is stronger than she is,
Yeah.
the inability to do so, wanting to scream, not being able to get a voice out, finally screaming but no one hearing, right? Like it's these
Yeah.
momentary, these minute interactions
Yeah.
that don't have to be sexually explicit but have to be emotionally explicit.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely. Oh, thank you. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh,
And
that's quite a
as
change.
you're writing it, just know that like, man, if you write every day or if you write in these big chunks, know that like you're going to write this and then you need to go write a happy scene because
Oh yeah.
it's going to hurt your heart. Does that make
I walked
sense?
away from it after I came out. It was written a long while ago, and I have edited it several times, thinking, I'm not writing a sexual book, but this happened, and it's happening to women as well as children, or it
Yeah.
was happening. I don't suppose it's happening so much now, but it was anyway. I changed.
Whenever I find that these scenes of assault are really powerful, it's more about the power and less about the sex.
Right,
Because
right,
it's a moment of intense loss of power in a very vulnerable way.
yeah,
And so
yeah,
lean into the loss of power. Um, lean into the pain of helplessness
yeah,
in this moment, and that'll keep it from being sexually explicit, but still give you the
yeah.
emotional
No, but
punch.
same emotional. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
that's very good.
yeah,
Yeah.
um, yeah. Well, Liz, I'm sorry, our time's run
I
out. Is there
know you've
anything we
done.
didn't talk about that you really wanted to
No,
cover?
no, absolutely, because I am now visualizing dozens of scenes and many of these chapters where I've written an exposition that I might have to draw out
Okay.
more in it. I had a momentary thought when I got that. Oh my God, this book's going to be 100,000 then. But what you've said and how to do it is far more explicit than I've ever heard.
Oh,
So it's
good.
really, really
I'm
good.
glad it's helpful.
Oh, it
Um,
has been. Thank you.
okay, I'm going to stop the recording and then we can talk a little bit more.
Okay. Oh wow, you've time. I thought you were all blocked up.